So have you ever thought the question, and I seem really, really loud to me, Seth, so maybe I'm not as loud out there, but it seems really loud. Thank you. Have you ever thought the question, when I get to heaven, the first person that I want to speak to is, who would it be, right? Or when I get to heaven, I want to ask Moses, what was it like to talk to a burning bush? Or what was it like, Noah, having to find all these animals? Did they just come to you? Or did you, how did you keep the lions from killing the zebras, right? Or Paul, was that light really, really, really that shiny? Or are you just like, for dramatic effect, telling us that it was that shiny in the Bible, So, like, there are these, questions that we ask, and we go, when I get to heaven, I want to do this and this and this. I want to ask these questions. And there's something just amazing in thinking about meeting someone famous. And when I was in college, I had the opportunity to meet one of the Twins players that was my favorite player. And now, I can't tell you anything about this Twins player. I don't know anything about him. I don't know how well he hit, Roland. I couldn't tell you. I looked him up on Google tonight. He played in the left field. That's about all I know of him. He was my favorite player. This is how well I paid attention to the Twins baseball, because he had long hair. So that's why I liked him. Right? Thank you. Yes. So this world, however, is full of people that are just trying to catch a glimpse of other people. Have you ever noticed that? We have paparazzi who are constantly following around famous people, whether they're celebrities or political people, just trying to get a picture of them. And the obsession to see a celebrity or famous person has sometimes come at a price, and it doesn't stop the pursuer from pursuing and trying to get those pictures. Truth be told, that if the Twins player that I had once enamored so many years ago were to walk into Promise tonight, I probably wouldn't be able to pick him out. I would be like, I don't know who you are, sorry. I probably wouldn't know him from Adam, but at one time, it was important that I see him and get a glimpse of him and just, meet him. Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 9 is the background of our message tonight, and I've titled my message, Just a Glimpse. Because just like myself in college desiring to see the Twins player, many people were lined up to see Jesus in this passage, but one person was there for a different reason. One person was there to get just a glimpse of Jesus, the one everyone had been talking about, the one everyone wanted to see. So let's read Luke 19, 1 through 9 together. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. "Zacchaeus," he said, "quick, come down. I must be a guest in your house today." Sorry, Noelle, I licked my finger. Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. "He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner," they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, "I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I have cheated anyone on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much." Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham." I can remember, Levon, maybe you did this in children's church, but I can remember growing up, learning the song, "Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed," Roland, you got to teach your kids this song. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And as the Savior passed that way, he looked up in the tree and he said, "Zacchaeus, you come down, for I'm going to your house today. I'm going to your house today." Like, that was an important song in kids' church to learn, right? Zacchaeus was someone who pursued Jesus because he wanted to get just a glimpse of Jesus. Zacchaeus was this rich tax collector. He was a chief tax collector. He was an important guy, right? You would think that an important guy like Jesus, kind of like, the head of the IRS today, would be able to see Jesus, would be able to get an audience of Jesus with Jesus. But he wasn't able to. Zacchaeus, no doubt, had taken more than what he had. He was a rich tax collector. He had taken more than what he should have when collecting taxes. He was also probably, my guess, a lonely man because of his occupation. Zacchaeus' desire when he heard that Jesus was walking through town was to just catch a glimpse of Jesus. That's all he wanted. He just wanted a glimpse. He was probably curious. Who is this guy that everybody's talking about? What's the big deal about him? I'm this important tax collector. I'm this important person. Nobody's coming to see me. Nobody's wanting to put lots of crowds around me, but everybody wants to see this guy. And we think about the story of Zacchaeus, we often think about two characters, Zacchaeus and Jesus, but I would pose that there's a third character, and that's the crowd. When I was thinking about this message and thinking about Zacchaeus pursuing his desire to see Jesus, it occurred to me that part of Zacchaeus' challenge in seeing Jesus was the crowd. See, Zacchaeus had the passion and the drive to see Jesus, and we know from history that Jesus frequently stopped to encounter those on the outskirts of the crowd. But Zacchaeus' story is different. Zacchaeus was blocked by the crowd. When I went to see the Twins player, I just had to stand in line for a long time and wait my turn to see him. But when you went to see Jesus, it wasn't quite that organized. We know from the woman with the issue of blood that the crowd pressed in on Jesus. And I imagine that the same scenario is probably going on here with Zacchaeus. The crowd is all around Jesus. Everyone wants a glimpse of Jesus. Everyone wants to see him, to touch him, to hear him, to encounter him, to experience him. Zacchaeus is too short to have any of that. Imagine that he is at the edge of this crowd and he's jumping on the outside of it and he just can't see him. He thinks, if I can just see Jesus, if I can just figure out what this guy's about. Zacchaeus doesn't want the whole touch, hear, feel experience. He just wants a glimpse. So he thinks and runs ahead of the crowd, and he finds a sycamore tree to climb, and he waits for Jesus and the crowd to come that way. What's he doing in the waiting? We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us how long it took for Jesus and the crowd to get there. It doesn't tell us what Zacchaeus was doing in the waiting. But Zacchaeus is waiting in the tree. But when Jesus arrives and the wait is over, Jesus looks up and he calls to Zacchaeus. Luke 19:5 said, when Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today. Now, do you think if he's traveling on the road, there's probably other trees along this road, right? So there's probably other people, maybe kids, that have gotten the same idea and climbed trees to see Jesus, right? So Zacchaeus, most likely, in my mind, isn't the only one in a tree trying to get a picture of Jesus, get a glimpse of Jesus. Do you think that there were others who Jesus could have called by name? Do you think that there are others that maybe should have been called by name? Jesus is surrounded by the crowd of people, surrounded by Jews who are excited to see him and hear what he has to say, and yet he calls Zacchaeus. He calls the tax collector. He calls the sinner that no one wants to associate with. He calls the one who just wanted a glimpse and says, Zacchaeus, come down. I must be a guest at your house today. Jesus wasn't caught up by the crowds. He wasn't caught up by the attention that he was receiving at the moment. He was only focusing on one person, Zacchaeus. And when Jesus called to Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus was ready. When we're looking for a glimpse of Jesus and when we start to pursue him, we need to be ready to hear him call our name. Jesus called Zacchaeus by name. Zacchaeus was now gone from just a glimpse, he had just wanted a glimpse, to being called. I can remember when I was a young girl and I was at family camp, I was in kids' church, and I heard Jesus say to me that I want you to go into the ministry. I was terrified. I'm like, there's no way. It's not happening. I am not doing that. I did not want to be a pastor. I did not want to be a missionary. I didn't want to do anything like that. But thankfully, I had great women of the faith who spoke into that calling and helped me understand that as a 9-year-old girl, I didn't have to preach to adults, but that there were other aspects of ministry that God could use me in. Zacchaeus had just made his way from anonymous, blending in with the crowd because he couldn't be seen above the crowd, to called because Jesus stopped and looked up. And it started with Zacchaeus wanting a glimpse and doing whatever he could to get that glimpse, but next it took Jesus stopping, looking up, and calling out. And when we look at the beginning of this passage, we see that Jesus is entering Jericho and just making his way through town. His plan wasn't to stop for Zacchaeus and go have supper at his house. His plan wasn't to call a tax collector out of a tree. His plan was to just go through town, continuing on his way. There are times throughout Jesus' ministry where he intentionally went places because he had someone he needed to see. When we see the Samaritan woman at the well, the Bible says that Jesus had to go through Samaria because Jesus had a destiny with that woman that he had to talk to. Luke 19 tells us that Jesus was walking through Jericho. It doesn't say that Jesus had to go through Jericho. It doesn't say that Jesus' intention was to stop in the middle of Jericho. It just says that Jesus was walking through Jericho, but he stopped and he looked up. I think about this with much of Jesus' ministry as he walked on earth. Much of what he did was interrupted stops. When Jesus healed the woman with the issue of blood, he was on his way to heal a girl who was dying. But he stopped because someone else touched him, and he needed to call her by name first. After Jesus fed the 5,000 and his disciples are out on his disciples went ahead on a boat and the storm comes up. Mark 6:48-50 says, he saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." As Jesus was walking towards them, he was about to pass them by. Jesus hadn't intended to stop for the disciples, but they cried out and he spoke to them. He called out to them. Jesus' earthly ministry was stopped by moments of need, and I wonder if we allow the same thing to happen to us. As my mom was in the hospital 3 weeks ago, and just before she passed away, Seth and I were at the thrift store, and Pastor Timothy came out, and we were talking about my mom, and Pastor Timothy asked if he could pray for her. It was in the middle of a shift at the thrift store, but he took the time to stop and ask how she was doing and allow for ministry to happen when it needed to. And I wonder if when we go throughout our day, if we allow moments like that to happen, where we might have little stops where God's got a little, nugget that we're supposed to be doing, but we get busy and we, miss those moments. Jesus could have simply passed Zacchaeus by. He didn't have to call out to Zacchaeus, and he definitely didn't have to tell him to come down, that he had to go to Zacchaeus' house that day. Jesus called to Zacchaeus out of a need Zacchaeus had, not out of a need that Jesus had. Zacchaeus thought he only needed a glimpse, but Jesus knew Zacchaeus needed so much more. My third point is what started as a glimpse turned into an encounter. Again, Jesus could have passed Zacchaeus by and not had any interaction with him. There was no need to. Zacchaeus was just curious about this guy walking by, right? But Jesus saw something that no one else saw. Jesus saw a hunger in Zacchaeus that needed to be filled. Jesus called to him, Zacchaeus! He said, quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today. Zacchaeus' response is quickly he climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. Zacchaeus had only wanted a glimpse. He just wanted to see this Jesus that everyone was talking about. He wanted to know firsthand what all the excitement was about, but Jesus called him by name, and he changed the glimpse into an encounter. Zacchaeus, who was a shrewd tax collector, collecting more than he should, and living as a wealthy man, had been called to have Jesus at his house for dinner. Can you imagine if you're walking down the road and this head of the IRS comes up to you and says, Roland, I'm coming to your house today. You're like, woohoo! I'm got this royalty coming to my house. I'm excited. I got to go home. I got to go buy the fattened calf. I got to get ready for this. That's what Zacchaeus has got going on in his head, right? He's like, woohoo! I got to go get ready. Jesus is coming to my house. What about Zacchaeus' excitement had to have been cut short, though, as the crowds around him began to whisper. The people were displeased. He's gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. I think to myself, what is Zacchaeus feeling in this moment? Would he have wanted to run away? He's a tax collector. He's probably used to people grumbling and complaining and whispering behind his back. He probably maybe didn't even hear it in one ear and out the other. Jesus is coming to his house. Who cares what people are saying, right? How do we react when people around us have this attitude? How does the conversation around you affect your attitude or affect your reaction? Remember earlier I said there were three people in this story, Jesus, Zacchaeus, and the crowd. The crowd played a pivotal part in Zacchaeus' meeting Jesus, and I think the crowd can sometimes get in our way of seeing Jesus as well. So what does that mean? Zacchaeus couldn't see Jesus because the people were in the way, and sometimes I think people get in our way. When we get really busy and we're seeing friends or doing things, even if it's ministry related, people can consume our time, and they can get in the way of our time with Jesus. I'm learning this right now, especially too, as I look for, desire to have a boyfriend, a mate. And I'm looking for someone special, that it's easy to get consumed with that and put that and get that in the way of me spending time with Jesus. And the crowd got in the way of Zacchaeus seeing Jesus. And if we aren't careful, we can put people in the way of our seeing Jesus. The other thing I'll say about the crowd is that we don't want to be in the crowd blocking people from seeing Jesus. How would we do that? I think of our actions or our words. What we say or how we say it can sometimes cause someone to be turned off or blocked from seeing Jesus. We also don't want to be the ones in the crowd that question Jesus when he calls out to someone and verbally criticizes the calling that God gives to someone. So, enough about the crowd. Zacchaeus went from a glimpse to a calling to an encounter that forever changed him. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. Jesus responded, salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. I love how verse 8 starts. It just says, meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood. When Jesus calls to us, do we pause? Do we take time to just stop whatever we're doing and listen to what Jesus is trying to tell us? Sometimes he's not verbally telling us anything. Sometimes he wants us just to stop and rest with him where we're at. Sometimes he's trying to tell us something. But do we just stop? The crowd around Zacchaeus is grumbling and unhappy at what they're seeing and experiencing. And Zacchaeus just stands before the Lord. And he stands and he's repentant and he's changed. An encounter with Jesus will result in a transformed life. You only need to open your Bible to find people who had encounters with Jesus and how it changes their lives. Look at the 12 disciples, or look at Paul, who used to be Saul, the great Christian persecutor, until he had an encounter with Jesus and his life was transformed. Look at David in the Old Testament, or Hannah, who cried for a baby, and her encounter gave her not only Samuel, but other children. Zacchaeus' encounter could have ended at the tree. Zacchaeus could have walked away before he even got to the tree, because I can't see, the crowd's in the way, forget it, might as well skip it. But he wanted a glimpse. An encounter with the living God changed Zacchaeus' life. He's giving money back to those that he took it from. He's giving more than he took from them. He's repentant and realizes the life he's lived is not the life he desires to continue living. A glimpse that led to a calling which changed into an encounter forever changed Zacchaeus' life. Salvation came to Zacchaeus' house that night again, not something Zacchaeus pursued, but something that came from an encounter with the living God. We are each on a journey to see Christ, whether we're at the glimpse stage, where we're just trying to look over the crowd. We just keep hopping up. I think I can see him, just to see who Jesus is. Maybe we've heard about Jesus all our lives, but haven't had a real encounter with him. Maybe the crowds are in the way, be it people or things that we put before God that occupy our time and don't allow us to see Jesus. Maybe we've climbed the sycamore tree and we're just waiting for Jesus to call us. If you're in the sycamore tree, are you ready for when he calls your name? What if Zacchaeus had been distracted in the sycamore tree and hadn't heard Jesus calling to him? What if you're on your phone? What if Zacchaeus had his phone out and was playing, Minecraft or Farm Town or whatever? What? Wordscapes. And Jesus is like, Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is like, hold on a second, I'm in the middle of a game. What if the noise of the crowd had overwhelmed the voice of Jesus calling out? Are your ears tuned to hear Jesus when he calls out to you by name? And when he calls out, what is your response? Jesus says, I want to come to your house. What's your response? Is it an enthusiastic yes, like Zacchaeus? Or is it a hesitant, okay, it's kind of messy, and I really should clean it up first, and I'm not expecting company, and today's really not a good day, Jesus. Can we do this maybe tomorrow or next week? See, Jesus is calling to each of us in his own way, in the way that each of us can and need to hear. My calling is different than Naomi's calling, and even Naomi's calling is different than Pastor Timothy's calling. But Jesus is calling out and saying, come to me. I must come to your house today. It's an urgency. There was an urgency in Jesus' calling when he was calling out to Zacchaeus and when he's calling out to us. It's not him saying, let's just think about this. He's eager to come and be part of your life. Are you eager to have him be part of your life? Will you allow the glimpse and calling to become an encounter? Just like the calling is different for everyone, so is the encounter. Saul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus left him blind for 3 days. But it also gave him the stopping time to realize who God was. And it allowed God to completely changed Paul's heart. I have a very dear friend who's reading through the Bible and experiencing God in new ways because she's reading through his word. She's been in church all her life, but allowing the glimpse to become an encounter through reading God's word has heightened her relationship with God. So are you pursuing the glimpse and allowing yourself to experience the encounter? This week, I've had a song that's been running through my head over and over and over. I haven't thought of this song in, I don't know how many years probably, because it's a really, really old song. But it has been in my head, like I'll wake up in the morning and it's in my head. I'll go to work and it's in my head. It's like just in my head. And so I think that it's something that we need to hear tonight. And so we're going